We're on? All right, thanks again. Degrees of disc damage. And you might be asking yourself, well, you were just talking about subluxation last week. What's the difference between a subluxation and a herniated disc? There isn't one. A herniated disc is the end result of a subluxation. Subluxations to begin with, that's just a pretty minor misalignment. And a lot of times, it's not even a misalignment, measurable as much as it is something tonal, meaning a postural change that under gravity is going to lead to, a certain position. So when we're looking at herniated discs, again, it's a subluxation. It's just the end stage of a subluxation when it doesn't get corrected. So the same things, the same mechanisms of cause when we're looking at a subluxation and a herniated disc, okay? So the most well-known would be the physical or the trauma, the physical stress. If I fall on my butt out on the ice, and the reason I'm giving this, it's you, Dan, because I had numerous people, not just Dan, last week, get out of their car, get out of their truck, boom, feet went out, bang, right down on their butt, herniated disc. This happened to my dad probably 5-6 years ago. He was outside and he went flat down on his butt hard, herniated his L5. And what a herniation is, okay, we got to probably go over a little bit of anatomy. So when you're looking at that, here's two segments, okay, the bones or the Waite Park, and that disc is the space in between. Can you see that?
I'm going to come in closer. There we go.
So the anatomy of the disc, the fibers around the outside, if you look at them, it looks like the rings of a tree. On a tree, they would call them the annular rings. On the disc, they're called the annular fibers because of that pattern. Okay? And then in the center is that nucleus, and that is actually in a sac, and it's pressurized. Okay, so there's pressure in that disc. So that's important because if we have a tear of the annular fibers, let's say I pick that bone up like that, and it doesn't come off the disc because that disc attaches those two bones. If I twist these two bones, or if I tear like that, literally tears, and then that pressurized nucleus will squirt out that side. It goes out the low pressure side. And when it comes out that side, there's that nerve root waiting to get hit, okay? So a herniated disc, they say 80% of us, there's like 80% of herniated discs have no pain because they herniate at a point where it maybe doesn't hit that nerve root. And then we just never know that it's there, and eventually it heals up. That happens. They see them on MRI all the time, and the people don't have any pain. But the mechanism that we're talking about here in terms of trauma is when we slip, we fall, we tear, and then what happens is that nucleus, you can see here, it migrates out or it squirts out that tear. And that's when it becomes an issue, is if it hits that nerve root, okay? So, that's not actually the most common story that I hear. I fell, I lifted something, I had an accident. More often than not, it's cumulative stresses over time, and somebody comes in and says, all I did was bend over to tie my shoe. All I did was bend over to pick up my wastebasket. All I did was grab my kid out of the chair, the booster chair, or out of the crib, and pop, and I've got this severe searing pain going down my leg. So if you hit one of those nerve roots at the bottom 3 or 4 nerve roots, those nerve roots all send branches off that becomes that sciatic nerve. So 9 times out of 10, they're going to have sciatic. They're going to have that pain going down the back of the leg. So that tear is an important part to remember. Okay, it's not just the misalignment; it's the fact that it misaligned to such a degree that it tore those fibers. And now we're going to have to get that bulge back in, but we're also going to have to keep it there long enough for the body to scar over that that tear. And it's important if you're sitting at home dealing with this herniated disc to remember the tear is still there. Even if I did a perfect adjustment and suck that bulge right back to center and you feel no pain, the tear is still there. It takes your body at least one generation of cell turnover to heal over that tear, okay? So the most common mechanism, like I said, is something that's cumulative over time. It's cumulative stresses. So we talked a little bit about the chemical stresses and the emotional stresses and how those can cause subluxation. And the sled dog research, that study was actually a good research and a good look into how neurological patterns or emotions can actually cause postural patterns in the body that lead to subluxation. Now, they would call that a subluxated pattern, and if you guys remember the story, the lead dog kind of pummels the lesser dogs into submission and makes them take this submissive posture where they round their curves. The normal curves, the dog has curves a lot like we have in our spine, but that's the normal curve, is an S curve in the spine. What they'll do is they'll take a C-shaped curve in submission to that lead dog. And you can take them out of that situation, and in this case, they just simply manipulated the dog. It's kind of like setting a reset button on their nervous system in their spine, and they can get them out of that posture, but as soon as they see that dog across the way, they bang, they're right back into that same posture and the same neurological pattern, okay? So, I didn't talk a lot about this, but this is a subluxation, but it's a very mild, what we call either a tonal model of subluxation or a tension, like a cord tension model of subluxation. The model of subluxation that we always think of is, okay, I fell on my butt, boom, that bone went like that, it's out of alignment, and I can see it on an x-ray, and I can feel it. That's not always how things start. Sometimes they start very mild with tension along the spine from, stress of some sort that's just kind of pulling and altering our posture. And now, when you have something like that, your body adapts to that. In the later stages, now it might lean away from that issue, okay? Adaptation is simply just moving your body either on a cell level or on a big level, moving away from pain, okay? So if you put an amoeba, a single-celled organism, in a dish, and then you put a poison on one side, that amoeba is going to move away from that poison. That's an adaptation. That's the ability to adapt, okay? So our body does that just naturally. It'll lean away from a pain or an injury, okay? That isn't necessarily subluxation yet, all right? But over time, now it heals. And when it heals in that position, now we're going to have some buckling there, and eventually we're going to have pressure again on that nerve root, and then we've got subluxation, then we've got trouble, okay? And the issue comes when, let's say, a hip, we've got tension down here, and it alters the hip height. Like we carry more tension in one side of our butt than the other. And we get some postural change like this. And the body leans, as a result, away from that side. You can walk around like this for a while. That short-term change, that adaptation is a short-term change just to get pressure off here, but you wouldn't want to do that long-term. So as this heals, if it has a chance to heal in this position, okay, at this angle, then the body compensates. And a compensation is adding something that wasn't there before. It's a curve, okay? And now what we've got curve there, under gravity, now we've got the potential for more herniations because under gravity, those discs are highly susceptible to shearing stress, okay? Rotation is a shearing of those fibers. If we have a disc at an angle like this and we've got the spine on top of it, that factor coming down like this to an angle, that causes a shearing stress. It's something that's going to tear, okay? And again, the important part, the most important part of that herniated disc isn't the actual bulge, it's the fact that there's a tear there, okay? So remember that. subluxation once it's full force, okay? Now, we can have, like I said, adaptations where the body will just kind of lean away from something, but then over time, it's going to compensate. And when it's in the earlier stages, people will come in and say, well, I had something like this happen 30 years ago, and I went into the chiropractor right away, it took one adjustment, and I was all better. When it's in that tonal stage, and it's mostly tone, it's mostly tension, they can just do they say 80% of the people, you hit them in the butt with a shovel, they would get better in that tonal stage because their body's basically waiting for a force to use to adjust itself. So 80% of the body, 80% of the time, in that tonal stage, the body will actually adjust itself, okay? It corrects the majority of its own subluxations. The problem comes when, again, it heals, but it heals improperly, and now the body has to put a compensation there. So that's when we see these curves start coming in, okay? And when I look at an x-ray and I see something like this, I know that that didn't just happen, regardless of whether that guy's telling me, no, this just happened. I bent over to pick up my shoe. Picking up your shoe did not cause a herniated disc, okay? There was something going on there for years before it got to that point where it was shearing enough and had torn through enough fibers that when you bent over to tie your shoe, that last fiber tore and out came that nucleus, okay? It's cumulative, so you might not notice it if it's just incremental small changes and small tears over time, but eventually that last fiber tears and the whole thing gives way and out comes that nucleus and now we've got a herniated disc. The difference between a bulge and a herniation is very small. It's just like, how big is it? But the difference between a herniation and a rupture is huge. Okay, so a herniation, there's a bulge there, big or small, but a rupture is all of that nucleus has squirted out. It's completely extruded outside of the disc. There's no repair to that. So, surgically speaking, when there's a bulge or herniation, usually they'll do a microdiscectomy. They'll go in through the back and they'll nip off that bulge, and then it'll heal over eventually, and there's no more bulge there hitting that nerve. But the position is still the same. So if the loading mechanism under gravity is still shearing, there's still more disc matter in there, more nucleus in there, and eventually it's going to extrude out probably that same plate, maybe above it or below it, you know. So the number one indicator as to whether you're going to have a herniated disc is, have you had a herniated disc before? Because if you had one, chances are they didn't correct that position, it's probably going to herniate again eventually if it's under those same stresses. So when I'm looking at an x-ray, that's what I'm looking at, is how long has this thing been there, okay? And we can see degeneration, and we can estimate about how long things have been there based on that degeneration. So here's that top view. The dark blue, of course, there is that nucleus, and here's where the nerve root branches off of the spinal cord. So this right here is the spinal cord, and that posterior bulge will hit the spinal cord sometimes and cause pain, you know, going out along that nerve root. Now there's a couple different types of bulges. This is called a central bulge, where it's actually hitting the cord. There's a lateral bulge where it comes more out here and it actually hits that nerve root, just the nerve root, okay? So I get these MRIs, but they do these MRIs laying down, which takes gravity off the whole situation, and it's just not even a helpful picture in probably 80% of the time. So when we do an x-ray on somebody with a central bulge like this, okay, what you're going to see is the opposite of what you'd expect to see. You'd expect to see, okay, an adaptation where there's pressure here, my body leans this way. Well, actually, it leans forward and then over this way to try and hydraulically push that bulge back into center. So if you see somebody like this come in and they got pain down that right leg, okay, that herniated disc causes pain down that leg, then And usually that's the only thing that will cause pain down the leg. A minor subluxation is not going to cause enough pressure to cause pain radiating down the leg. If you have pain radiating down the leg or down an arm, there is a disc involved, okay? So remember that. And there's a tear there. So in this case, this person has pain down the right leg, but their spine, when you look at it on the x-ray, is leaning this way. That's the adaptation for a central bulge. They'll lean forward and they'll lean over it, and it'll try to hydraulically suck that back to center. Whereas a lateral bulge, if it were coming out more straight to the side here, hitting that nerve root, that one's what you'd expect. They lean away from that, and they got pressure down this, pain down this leg, okay? So we can identify a herniated disc on an x-ray by the way that the person's leaning and by the symptomatology there, okay? So these are examples of compensations, right? When that initially, the tree beside these trees here grew high enough to block the sun, the adaptation was we're going to start to lean. And you can see right here, that lean, okay? It was leaning off at like a 30-degree angle there. And then eventually, it had to put something there, a curve, that wasn't there before, okay? And that happens in trees and all living things, that compensation, where maybe we had something in our spine that we were born with, an extra vertebrae or a hemivertebrae, and the body will grow around it, okay? It'll put a curve there. But there's no pressure there, so that's not a subluxation, and more than likely, even though there's a curve there, it's gradual enough that there's not going to be extreme buckling points, okay? So people with a scoliosis, if you have a scoliosis or you've been diagnosed with scoliosis, just because you have curve doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have disc problems or that you have even a subluxation, because sometimes that's just the body's natural response to a short leg, a hemivertebrae, a malformed sacrum, something like that, okay? But here's an example of what they do cosmetically when somebody has a curvature in their spine. They'll do the Harrington rods, okay? Now, what I'm getting at is something like this doesn't just get there overnight, doesn't just happen like that in a week or a day. It usually starts down here with the lean, where the body's leaning away, all right? This person had pain down the left leg. She had a disc bulge at the L5, and there was a lean there. And then eventually, that doesn't get taken care of. It heals, and then the body compensates, puts a compensation here, that curve, to get her head back over the center of gravity. But now we've got another issue. Under gravity, over time, we've got buckling points where gravity meets these angles here, okay? And what's the number one indicator as to whether you're going to have a herniated disc? Have you had a previous herniated disc, right? Because we know that when you have a herniated disc down here, there's a compensation, okay, over time. And when you add gravity to those compensations, eventually we're probably going to have a shear stress that tears, and now we've got a herniated disc. Now, most chiropractors and most medical doctors, when they look at that MRI and they see a herniated disc up here, what they're going to do is they're going to go after that herniated disc. They're going to go after the disc, okay? Or if they have it up here, they're going to go after that, what they see on the MRI. But if we level this out down here, everything comes back into center, and that compensation isn't needed anymore, so it compensates back. So, Lindsay, I'm talking to you, she's got something like this going on, a bad herniated disc, and what they saw on the MRI was a herniation in the upper lumbars, okay? And what I found was a misalignment actually of her sacrum and her hips, which causes that side to drop, puts a curve there, like this, okay, puts a curve there, and then over time, she was bending over to pick up the kid out of the crib, and boom, herniated disc here. But that buckling is what So the first thing I did was level out that sacrum, and that straightened up her spine significantly. And the next day, she's like, wow, I've got no pain going down my leg there, okay? There's still a tear there, and that's what I always have to warn people. Just because we do a great adjustment and that bulge sucks back in there centrally and takes the pressure off that nerve, doesn't mean there's not still an issue there, okay, that needs to heal. So those tears, that's the big issue. That subluxation, that misalignment, that's an issue, but it's that tear that gets overlooked, and that's why people will constantly re-injure these things, okay? So I might have shared this with you guys before too, but Jacob, 40 years old, history of low back pain going down his leg. Which leg was it going down, would you guess? It was going down the left leg, okay? So what does his body do? This is in the early stages, okay? There's not a curve there. There's still just a lean, okay? See how he's only leaning way off to the right there? He's not leaning and then a curve comes and brings him back to center. So it hasn't been there for that long. It hasn't had time to compensate. This is just an adaptation. He's leaning away from the pain, okay? So this is still in the early stages. It's not just a tonal because we can see it on an x-ray, all right? But it's in the early stages of degeneration, and there hasn't been degeneration or compensation there. So just by working on that L5 disc and that hip, which is what originally probably started that buckling, that hip was higher, which causes a buckling point at L5, kind of like I showed you before. If this hip was higher, then there's going to be a buckling point at that L5. That's the first movable segment. Eventually it tears, okay? Or it squishes it. However it happened, he ended up with that herniated disc. He's leaning already, and what we do is we adjust that hip and we adjust that L5. And we get that bulge to suck back in there, and we get everything to come back to center. And within 90 days, it was 100% because we got that bulge to suck back in, and then it had enough time, straight for that tear to heal over. And scar tissue is actually tougher than the original annular fibers. That scar tissue is never going to tear again. It might tear above it or below it if he's doing something crazy. But that's just the mechanisms. Like I said, it's sometimes on rarer occasion than you think, it's a trauma, but most times it's something that's going to be cumulative, either cumulative physical stresses, like I'm doing repetitious motions at work where I'm doing a lot of rotation, a lot of lifting, and it's constantly tearing at those little fibers little by little, and then all of a sudden, that one last time, boom, it tears, and I get that full-on extrusion of the nucleus. But more often than not, it's something that probably isn't physical. It's something related to a posture that was stress-related, okay? That changed our posture, that changed that loading, that then over time causes that shear stress, tears that fiber, and then away goes that disc, okay? So those are the big things that I want you guys to take away from tonight. If you have pain down a leg or pain down an arm, there is a disc involved, okay? There isn't really a difference between a subluxation and a herniated disc. That's just the end result of that subluxation or that misalignment. And at that end stage, again, there has to be that tear. However it happens, whether it's stress over time or it's trauma, there's a tear there. And just remember that even if you get the best chiropractic adjustment that's ever been given and it sucks that bulge right back to center, it's going to take your body at least one generation of those cells in that disc turning over to heal it and scar it, okay? So don't do anything stupid for the next 90 days if you can help it, all right? Thank you guys. I'm going to cut it short tonight. I'm losing my